Discussions in Depth Psychology is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. Your host is Bonnie Bright. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Discussions in Depth Psychology, which is powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute. I'm your host, Bonnie Bright, and this series brings you discussions with some of the individuals who are contributing to the field of depth psychology in very profound and important ways. And today my guest is Tanya Marie Luhrmann, who is the Watkins University Professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department, and whose research has focused on individuals who are psychotic and who experience unusual sensory experiences, including hearing voices. And Dr. Luhrmann is also going to be presenting at the upcoming Trauma and Transcendence conference, which is happening at Pacifica in June of 2018. So welcome, Tanya. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm really happy to have you with me. I just find that some of the research that you're doing is absolutely fascinating. In just a moment, I'm going to read a biography for Tanya so that everyone can have more background on her and her research. But before I do that, I just want to let you know that if you would like to find out more about the Trauma and Transcendence Conference, you can go to pacifica.edu and click there on the events link. And under the events link, you'll find the retreat. And that's where all of the conference information is for Trauma and Transcendence. And of course, there's an amazing lineup of scholars who are going to be presenting on that topic, including Dr. Tanya Luhrmann. So more about Tanya. Dr. Tanya Marie Luhrmann, Ph.D., is the Watkins University Professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department. Her work focuses on the edge of experience, on voices, visions, the world of the supernatural, and the world of psychosis. She has done ethnography on the streets of Chicago with homeless and psychotic women and worked with people who hear voices in Chennai, India, Accra, Ghana, and the South Bay, San Francisco Bay Area. She has also done fieldwork with evangelical Christians who seek to hear God speak back, with Zoroastrians who set out to create a more mystical faith, and with people who practice magic. She uses a combination of ethnographic and experimental methods to understand the phenomenology of unusual sensory experiences, the way they are shaped by ideas about minds and persons, and what we can learn from this social shaping that can help us to help those whose voices are distressing. She was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2003 and received the John Guggenheim Fellowship Award in 2007. When God Talks Back was named a New York Times Notable Book of the Year and a Kirkus Review's Best Book of the Year. She has published over 30 op-eds in the New York Times, and her work has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Review of Books, The Times Literary Supplement, Science News, and many other publications. Her new book, Our Most Troubling Madness, Schizophrenia and Culture, was published by the University of California Press in October of 2016. So, Tanya, I mean, there's a lot in that bio there, and I'm really excited to jump into it. I hope that we're able to cover a lot of the different topics that we have just touched on here briefly. But let's start by talking a little bit about psychotic disorder and specifically about schizophrenia. You've obviously done a lot of research around this, and recent statistics I know show that schizophrenia affects approximately 1.1% of the world population over the age of 18, and that includes as many as 51 million people worldwide. So that's quite a lot of people that are affected by it, and of course everyone who knows somebody who's affected by it is also drastically affected. So maybe you can begin by saying just a little bit about how schizophrenia is viewed from various perspectives or cultures, and that would include both historically and currently, because I imagine that that has changed over time.
So schizophrenia is understood now as a disorder in which people have mistaken perceptions. So they seem to hear or see things that other people don't. And they have mistaken beliefs. They seem to think things about the world which other people don't. And those commitments, those perceptions and their beliefs are so afield of other senses of what's real and normal that people regard them as ill. And to meet criteria now, you need to have some array of distorted perceptions and beliefs and experiences. And it needs to be distressing enough so that your life kind of falls apart in significant ways. You know, your life or your work become very, very difficult for you for some significant period of time. So that disorder, that complex of phenomena, on the one hand, It's probably found everywhere in the world. You get a little bit of pushback against that at different times of our own history, at different times. People have thought that schizophrenia was just something that was defined by local understandings of what's normal. But I guess I am now persuaded of the view that something like that array of phenomena are really there in the world. There is a little bit of a question of whether that, what we now call schizophrenia, whether it existed in the world before the Industrial Revolution. It's something that scholars debate because it's kind of hard to find something like schizophrenia, something that's unavowedly like schizophrenia in, say, the biblical, in the scriptures or in Shakespeare. But I tend to be of the school that thinks that this is something about things that go wonky in the brain and affect the body in particular ways. Now, that being said, it's probably the case that how people interpret those experiences has differed a lot across time and space. And so one thing to say is that we know that some people, when they fall ill, are really, really ill, and some people are not so ill. So it's quite possible that people who a clinician would say, well, they have something like a story in the body that looks like what I would call schizophrenia, might be interpreted religiously in other domains, might be seen as if they were possessed by demons, or might be seen as prophets. So some people might say that somebody like Ezekiel in the Bible is somebody who became a vehicle for God, but whose body was eerily similar to some of the bodies that we now identify with schizophrenia. That's what I would say. There's something like this condition that's probably there everywhere. We think that when people are really sick, they're recognized as sick everywhere. But people who are farther down the healthy side of that continuum, they're probably interpreted in many different ways.
Well, so that's interesting because what I'm taking from what I heard you say is that, first of all, often it's distressing enough when it occurs to somebody that their life falls apart in significant ways. And yet at the same time, if this is in reality a phenomena that, I guess whether it's real or not, it kind of depends a little bit on what kind of relationship the person who's being affected has with that phenomena. So if they're hearing voices,
Right.
for example, are they terrified by this or traumatized by it, or are they able to actually have some kind of relationship or come into maybe even some conversation with it? Has your research shown that people have varying experiences like this, and does that affect the outcome of their experience?
Absolutely. So this is actually what I'm working on now. I mean, it used to be thought in our country that voices, people with this condition, they often hear what we call voices. They have auditory or quasi-auditory experiences of invisible others. And, psychiatric scientists used to think that these voices were just the side effects, the byproducts of the disorder. And you shouldn't pay any attention to them. They were unreal, but also they were very painful to people. They were just the byproducts of the disorder. Now we have learned that the way people respond to their voices probably has an impact on what their voices say and about how costly those voices are for them. So one of the things that I have seen in my work is that if you talk to people who meet criteria for schizophrenia in the U.S. and in Ghana and in South India, and more recently in Shanghai, one of the things you see is that the Americans who hate their voices the most, who seem to be most articulate about the meanness of their voices on average, and we now know that that caustic quality may be bad for the course and outcome of the disorder. And because there are cultural variations, that implies that the way that you listen to your voices might actually affect the way that you experience them. So that the American experience of being assaulted by these voices may actually be very, very costly for Americans who suffer from the disorder.
So it sounds like there is definitely a difference among cultures in how the disorder, as you just called it, is being treated or is generally looked at and perceived. And it sounds like it's quite harsh for Americans, as you just mentioned. Of course, there's a famous story, which I'm sure you're familiar with, of Carl Jung, who was treating a woman, a patient, who believed that she lived on the moon and that the children on the moon were threatened by this vampire. And she was apparently quite traumatized, and I think that the story really represents, for those who know it, the way that Jung was able to help her to come into some kind of relationship with this. Rather than denying it or suggesting that she was completely crazy, he actually brought the archetypal realm into that psychosis. And so I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but I'm curious if you, in your research, are aware of situations where that is the kind of treatment that actually is helpful in such cases.
Well, I don't know that story in particular. It's been a long time since I've read Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. I can say that there's a lot of scientific arguments about this, but let me suggest there are two kinds of processes in the body. One is something that I would call psychosis, which is this disconnect from reality that seems so radical and different. The other is what you might loosely call dissociation, which is like a trance-like capacity to get really disconnected from the world, but somehow include someone's capacity to return. And both of those conditions, the way that the therapist helps the person to listen, may affect whether the person is able to return. So there's now a new movement in Europe called the Hearing Voices movement. And what they do is that they teach people to respect their voices. They teach people with schizophrenia, paradoxically, to treat their voices as persons, to respect them as persons. And they find that some people are able to, in effect, persuade their voices to become more reasonable persons. It's kind of like this old kindergarten idea that if you respect people, they respect you in turn. And this movement suggests that for people with schizophrenia, that might work. We know that that works with people who dissociate. So one of the things that's true of dissociation is that people who go in and out of these funny states are often connected to trauma. They have more control through their imagination. You know, in some sense, the capacity to go into a daydream is a low-level dissociative state. And so Jung sort of worked at the borderlands between dissociation and psychosis. It's never clear to me exactly where he was in that borderland. Lots of debates about what that border consists of. But we know that using your imagination to interpret your experience is always helpful for you, but it doesn't necessarily make the problem go away. So there are clearly people who have positive interpretations of their voices and who find that the voices tell them to do terrible things and then they do them. You know, when we talk about teaching people to think about their voices differently, this is a lot of work. There's something about these experiences, particularly with psychosis, that have just become deeply ingrained in people's experiences of their world. So it's important not to have a kind of a romantic idea about, gee, if we just didn't call it schizophrenia, all our problems would go away. That wouldn't happen.
Right, yeah. It seems to me that there is something profoundly, I'm prone to use the word archetypal because of my own training in depth psychology, but something that is really deeply beneath the surface, a pattern that actually has to shift, that one has to come into relationship. And as you said, maybe there is more control that can be had through the imagination, but there's also something, again, coming back to, as you suggested, almost like a negotiation with those voices, and that is that coming into relationship with something that is very real in some dimension somewhere, right? So I think that's really interesting. And I wonder, though, if you would say more about the trauma piece, because you just brought that up. And, of course, we had started this conversation by mentioning the upcoming conference at Pacifica on trauma and transcendence. And I guess I wonder what the connection is between trauma and schizophrenia and related disorders, of course, and also if you can say more about how that could possibly be transcended. So trauma is a complicated category. I think if you look at our country, you can get a percentage of like 80 to 90% of people struggling with some kind of trauma.
And so once you're talking about that level of trauma identification, then it's like, oh, what does that mean? How can it explain anything in particular? But we know that two things are true. We know that the more people report trauma in their childhood, the more that they report that they've had, unwelcome and inappropriate sexual contact as kids, the more they were beaten up by other kids or parents physically or emotionally, the more bad things that happen to them, the loss of a parent, the loss of a guardian, the higher their risk goes for schizophrenia. So there's something about the vulnerable body that is very, very real. And some people think that when people with schizophrenia hear voices, that their voices are carrying the message of their trauma for them. So some of the hearing voices movement will say, that's why you need to listen to those voices. You need to listen to respect the message and the understanding that your voices give to you. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is often, like in the psychiatric world, often understood a little differently. It's more this kind of domain of trance and dissociation, that something bad was going on to people as kids or adults, and as the event was going on, people went into an altered state to kind of protect themselves from the experience. And then the memory remains sort of alive for them. So there's one kind of story that says, we have vulnerable bodies, we're beaten up by life, our vulnerable body succumbs. There's another kind of the story that says, an event happens, at the moment in time of the event, you protect yourself from the event, and the memory lives on for you. So those are very different ideas about what's going on in the psyche of the person who is in torment. And it suggests somewhat different ways of transcending the experience. For the person who has a toxic memory, it suggests that the person transcends the experience by gaining access to the memory that they don't have and interpreting that in a way that feeds their life's meaning. The vulnerable body, it suggests that you have a vulnerable body and you've got to figure out how to handle what's happened to your body after the insult. And that also can be a spiritual intervention. But it suggests that what you really need is not so much working with memories. You need a loving community. You need a God who cares for you. You need to feel embraced by the universe. You need to have that sort of social relationship that might have been disconnected.
Yes, well, I think these are really important things that you're pointing to. I know there's been a lot of discussion in many communities, but particularly the depth psychology community as well, about whether or not religion is actually serving us in some of these ways, and whether or not people in today's day and age, with all its modernity and technology, are actually feeling like they are embraced. Well, number one, by community, because in some ways we're so separated by social media and all that it represents and the technology and the devices, but also our belief in a larger power that takes care of us and loves us and embraces us. What has your research shown about that?
Well, it's me and many other people. It's clear that if you are able to be in relationship with a loving God, it's probably better for your body. So what I saw in my research was evangelicals who learn to develop an intimate relationship with a loving God. I really saw that this involves a lot of micro-attention and careful work in which people start to reinterpret some thoughts as being thoughts from this invisible other. And they work with the church community to interpret their everyday lives as containing signs that this invisible other is there for them. And the church community, particularly the church community I was spending time in, was just really, really focused on trying to remind you that this invisible other was deeply, deeply loving and caring. And we know from other people's work that you look at these big data sets, which often have some data point, like, do you go to church? How often do you go to church? And then you look at these data sets with thousands of people, and the more you go to church, the healthier you are, the longer you live. We know that, and some slightly more careful epidemiological work suggests that, I think this is Chris Ellison's work, the more you pray if you're praying to a God that you experience as loving you, the less mental illness you report. But the more you pray to a God that you experience as judging you, the more mental illness you report. What I saw is that it really takes attention and effort to hold on to this sense of an invisible being who always cares the best for you and is there for you, because that's such a hard thing for humans to do. And to really commit to that perspective takes a lot of attention.
Right. And I think that a lot of people who are listening to this particular interview will probably relate very deeply to what you said, particularly in terms maybe, however, of the self with a capital S, as you called it, or soul, and the sense or feeling that one is guided by that particular aspect of oneself, or that one is actually receiving directions or insights or help from that particular self. So I think regardless of what you call it, you know, you're right about that.
So I think one of the big challenges of human life is to manage what it sounds like you're calling the soul, that sense of non-me advice. So if you think about God, I mean, however you understand what's coming through from what some people would call beyond the veil, beyond what William James called the more, the experience of the human is that the human learns to be in accord with a non-me source, which has a certain emotional quality. And what I see with psychosis and dissociation is that often people imagine and experience that non-me as toxic. And where humans want to be is to have a relationship with that voice, that conscience, that soul, that guide, which is both morally virtuous, but also loving. And people imagine that in different cultures in different kinds of ways. But I think that's part of the human quest. I think it's hard. It takes work.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're exactly right. And I know some people would call that the religious function of the psyche, that longing to be in some kind of relationship or engagement with that non-me source. And of course, by non-me, again, from a depth psychological standpoint, we would look at that as the non-ego, or what gets us through our daily life. And it's easy to see how through trauma that could be absolutely contaminated in some way, in the sense that it might feel toxic, as you said.
Well, in some ways, people who have been traumatized may also be gifted. So one of the things that's also true is that if you've been beaten up by life, you are the body is more likely to produce these experiences of non-me-ness. And, you know, often those are negative experiences. But the fact of there being this sense of otherness can be for people an enormous opportunity. So in some ways, you know, there's this old story about the wounded healer. In some sense, the person who has struggled with demons is also more able to find God. I mean, it's still that sense of the other. And then if you have the capacity to transform the demon into God, then that can be very helpful. Some gods are kind of demonic, so it's not an easy fix.
Exactly. That just speaks so eloquently to exactly what you've been saying about the connection, the relationship, the context of how we locate ourselves within the experience that's happening, whether it's voices and schizophrenia or something else that is quite traumatic, either the symptom or the initial cause of the symptom. If we do have this tendency, however, to look for that non-me self, you know, I guess from one perspective, you could look at it in the sense that we are all wounded in one way or another just through our everyday human experience. Of course, there are varying levels of that, and we see that if you start looking at trauma as a scale. But there are clearly some people who are probably then seeking out those voices in order to find the insights, the sense of community, the sense of engagement. I know that you've done some work with people who practice or experience spirit possession. Can you say a little bit more about that research and how that relates here?
So this is research I've done in tandem with a project that I've been running recently. on spiritual curiosity, and I've been working with a postdoctoral fellow, John Doolan, in Ghana, and he located traditionalists, people practicing a non-Christian traditional religion in which experts, okomfu, come into relationship with the local gods. And this is a world in which there are many, many, many spirits and gods, that there's people who are priests and priestesses will imagine often a kind of a high god, but they'll also imagine many more local individual gods. And so what they describe is an experience of learning to come into relationship with these gods. So I was there last summer and spent quite a bit of time talking to people about their experience. And what they describe, what people will say, is that the person who becomes this traditional expert, this person possessed by the gods, first of all, this is a role in the society. So these experts, you'll see signs for these experts along the streets. These experts are often the first line of medical defense for people, and they are often used as a kind of protection against the malevolent forces that are assumed to exist in the universe. So somebody becomes this kind of expert if the gods call them, and often that call is out loud. And then it's said that often people struggle around the call. They don't want to become trained, because if you train, you've got to basically don't have sex for a couple of years, you don't wear shoes for a couple of years, you don't wear proper clothes for a couple of years. It's embarrassing and painful, and so many people struggle. And during the period of struggle, other people will say that they're mad. And so if the person goes along with it and decides to become trained, people will say that in the training, people will learn to identify the God who speaks. They will learn how not to pay attention to the demons. And they will develop a loving relationship, a quasi-loving relationship, at least not a toxic relationship, with the gods that are in communication with them. And so one of the things that I was interested in was, in talking with people, how many of them had something that seemed like they might have schizophrenia, and how many of them did not. And one of the things that I think that we saw is that there were some people in this group who looked like they had something like a psychotic process and had learned to manage it and to, in effect, use their experience of hearing voices and to use them to more positive ends. Some people just liked going into trance, and they didn't seem like they had this kind of bodily vulnerability at all. And some people seemed like they were really reporting a trauma story in which, again, they had done the work of transforming their experiences into something a little more positive.
That's such a fascinating description. And I think what prompted me to ask the question was because of your description of the wounded healer. And it just feels like, upon hearing that, again, most of these people have been through something, probably was traumatic, no matter how it came about, even if it was just the process of hearing the voices and going through the difficulties that they had in becoming the kind of person who plays that role in the spirit possession. But they are bringing something to the community, clearly, that hopefully can be healing to others, in the sense that they have already worked through it on their own to whatever extent that they have. So I think it's a really powerful example of how another culture has managed to take on this very distressing, to use the word that you used at the very beginning of our conversation, condition where sometimes one's life can completely fall apart when this begins to happen. Not that their lives weren't falling apart before, especially if it was initiated by trauma, but when the symptoms begin to show up, and of course one realizes that we're considered crazy in our current Western culture if this is what's happening, then I think that the trauma is actually compounded quite dramatically. And so I wonder if you can say a few words about that, expound on that, and also just maybe introduce what you think the role of this more spiritual perspective can be about illness, especially illness stemming from trauma, how it can be integrated into the medical model that we currently embrace in the West.
So I think that the medical model that we currently embrace tends to be very cautious about what it regards as irrational symptoms or irrational experiences. The voice is speaking, but there's no person there, so you shouldn't encourage the person to experience that voice. One of the things that I see happening in Europe, and quite strikingly in a recent publication from the British Psychological Society, is that these European clinicians are willing to say, okay, let's not insist that people accept a medical model. If people find it more helpful to experience these voices or symptoms in a more spiritual way, and that's helpful to them, they should do that. If they find medication is often very helpful, but then they have these complicated ideas about medication. Long-term use of medication can also be costly to the body. So I tend to be sympathetic to that. I tend to be sympathetic to the view that a spiritual perspective can be helpful for people. It can help them to come to terms with their experiences. It might help them to transform their experiences. I don't think it's a panacea. I have met people who had spiritual interpretations of their voices, and those spirits told them to do terrible things, and then they did them. But I think to have a more spiritual understanding gives people the possibility of a little bit more control over the experience, paradoxically enough. I think there's something very deep about the observation that when you give more reality, whether you give more personal reality to these events, and you respect this invisible person as a person, even as a divine person, then it makes it a little easier for that invisible other to be experienced as a respectable person. And then I think also people in some spiritual contexts become less afraid of the events. I mean, again, I think that a wise clinician is always an asset to somebody who is struggling. But I think the wise clinician negotiates somebody's interpretation of their experience and whatever biomedical model that clinician might possess.
Yeah, wow. So beautifully said. And actually hearing you say that just gives me personally so much hope for new ways that we can bring all of this more of a depth psychological or spiritual perspective into the clinical work that is going on in the U.S. and in the Western world as well, with people who are suffering greatly often from this very debilitating disorder. Well, I really appreciate all of the knowledge that you've shared with us, and I'm really excited and looking forward to hearing your talk at the upcoming conference, Trauma and Transcendence, which is happening, of course, at Pacifica in June of 2018. I've been speaking with scholar and researcher Dr. Tanya Marie Luhrmann, who is, of course, a Watkins University Professor in the Stanford Anthropology Department, and whose research has focused on individuals who are psychotic, who often hear voices, in fact. And to find out more about the conference at Pacifica, you can go to pacifica.edu and click on events and then the retreat at Pacifica. And to find out more about Tanya and her work, you can go to her website, which is luhrmann.net. That's spelled LUHRMANN.net. And of course, her most recent book is called Our Most Troubling Madness, Schizophrenia and Culture, and that's through the University of California Press. So, Dr. Luhrmann, thank you so much for spending some time with me today.
It's been lovely. Thank you very, very much.
You've been listening to Discussions in Depth Psychology, powered by Pacifica Graduate Institute with host Bonnie Bright. Learn more at pacificapost.com or at pacifica.edu.